Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's UWI-SIP program. The UWI-SIP is a collaborative initiative of the HEU, Center for Health Economics, the Department of Economics, and the Economic Society of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Today's topic is the Youth Budget Forum, the Youth Perspectives on the Trinidad and Tobago 2023 budget. I would now like to introduce our moderator for today's proceedings, Ms. Haleema Ali Sisbane. Ms. Haleema Ali Sisbane is an economist and project specialist at the Center for Health Economics, the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. Ms. Ali Sisbane has over 15 years experience in conducting research regionally. She has a key interest in furthering opportunities to empower young people. She's also an attorney at law in training. Please welcome Ms. Ali Sisbane.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Richards, for that very warm welcome. Good afternoon, all, and welcome to our youth budget discussion, our youth budget forum. It is indeed a pleasure to be the moderator for today's session. This initiative is really a collaboration between the UWI Youth Social Impact Platform, also known as UWI-SIP, and the Youth Economic Forum, established and well known as the YEF, Youth Economic Forum. A bit of background information and provide some context before we actually get into the meat of the matter today. UWI-SIP is an initiative by the HU Center for Health Economics, and the YEF is a collaborative effort of the HU Center for Health Economics, the Department of Economics, and the Economics Society, which is the student body at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. Now, the coming together of these three groups really augurs well as they share a common vision to advance opportunities for youth empowerment. I take this opportunity also on behalf of the director of the HU Center for Health Economics, Dr. Ruqayyah, to welcome you today to this youth budget discussion. Dr. Ruqayyah has really been a visionary and has performed an important role in birthing both the YEF and the UWI-SIP initiatives. I also commend the Department of Economics and the Economic Society for their encouraging and timely response to collaborate with the HU to mastermind this initiative, and kudos to the collaborators. Now, since the inception of the Youth Economic Forum, the HU, the Department of Economics, and the Economic Society have furthered their efforts to continue to create opportunities for the views of young people to come to the fore. What we see today and what we are experiencing today is real evidence of the success of this real meaningful partnership. Events like these can really provide young people with an opportunity to voice their opinions and raise their concerns, which will have a positive impact on their level of engagement, but more so, perhaps can have an impact on policy. It is widely recognized that investing in youths have ripple effects benefiting society at large. And to this end, I want to encourage everyone to continue to echo the sentiments of many before us that youth voices matter. Today, we have a packed panel who will share their views on various aspects of the Trinidad and Tobago budget, which was recently read in Parliament. This year's budget would have generated much discussion from different perspectives and from different groups. And it's only fitting that we provide a forum through which young persons can be afforded an opportunity to share their views on such matters. Before I introduce the first presenter, I want to urge members of the audience to share their thoughts, their comments, their suggestions, their questions with us via the chat option, and we will endeavor to answer as many of them within the allotted time. So on to our first presenter, Ms. Stephanie Theodore. Stephanie is a graduate of the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus and Cape. She is a passionate advocate for mental health and the promotion of holistic wellness. Stephanie is also a young entrepreneur in the business of agriculture and wellness. Join me in welcoming Stephanie as our first panelist.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Haleema, for that introduction. Let me just share my. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yes, Stephanie, we see.
Okay. Okay. So thank you and good afternoon again. Today, I am here to share perspectives on the Trinidad and Tobago National Budget for fiscal 2023. I have chosen to focus my presentation on budget measures in the agricultural sector, in small business and medium enterprises, and I will also share some mental health perspectives. Now, we are here to talk about the budget. So I think it's important for us to have an understanding of what fiscal policy is. Fiscal policy is an essential tool used to influence economic growth. And the main instrument of fiscal policy is the national budget. Objectives of fiscal policy include boosting employment levels and economic development, and in maintaining an economy's rate of growth. Tools of fiscal policy include taxation and public spending, and fiscal policy can be expansionary or contractionary. The context in which the budget was formulated is one in which, prior to COVID-19, our economy would have taken some major hits. There was a sudden collapse of the global energy commodity prices during the period 2014 to 2015, and this would have drastically declined government revenues. By 2019, our economy was on a growth trajectory of about 0.9%, but then 2020 to 2021, we had the pandemic with stay-at-home orders and severe depression in economic activity. Now, the 2022 war in in Ukraine has caused supply constraints, escalating commodity prices. Now let's talk about agriculture. So following on from an injection in last year's budget, there was an injection in the current budget of 300 million to stimulate the agricultural sector. And there was mention of the roadmap to recovery in the budget. And the budget more or less echoed the policies outlined in the roadmap. Some of the immediate priorities of the roadmap were to address and mitigate the hardship inflicted by COVID-19, to restart the economy, and to lay the foundation for sustained economic recovery. And we see some of this illustrated in the measures for the agricultural sector. Some of the specific measures mentioned include keeping agriculture as a tax-free sector, the targeting of youth, the boosting of agricultural production, and strengthening supply chains. And for me, some of the main takeaways coming out of the budget for the agricultural sector is the emphasis on access to food. As mentioned earlier, the war in Ukraine put pressure and has caused supply constraints. So this budget has indicated that we want to increase access to the local food supply. So we want to push local food production. And I think that this is good. Another emphasis found in this year's budget was to reduce the cost of food. And I think that the tax-free environment and also the boosting and strengthening of the agricultural sector, we should expect to see prices decrease, food prices decrease. There was also a strong linkage between the agricultural sector and the health sector. The minister even mentioned that food consumption is directly linked to food systems. And he also went on to say that the pandemic would have placed a spotlight on communicable diseases, highlighting the way that our diets have negatively impacted our health. Now, it's good to see the link between the health sector and the agricultural sector, because for a long time we have known that our import bill has been way too high. Food imports are more than $5 billion. But further to the economic cost, we also have a health cost, because we know that a lot of the imported foods are highly processed foods, and therefore this is also detrimental to our health. Another emphasis I saw in this year's budget in agriculture was the targeting of youth in the sector towards the sustainability of the sector, because due to aging in the industry, the main thing is that the key players of the agricultural sector are aging, and there is room for much needed youthful energy in the sector. Now, while these measures are promising, based on past experiences, the weaknesses here would be if we do not have the appropriate measures in place for follow-up, follow-through, and implementation of these strategies. Now, moving on to the small and medium businesses. We saw that there was increased access to finance through the National Entrepreneurship Development Country, through partnership with, and also through partnership with the commercial banks, with a stimulus of $500 million towards a long-term guarantee scheme for small and medium enterprises. We also saw an increase in the VAT registration threshold from 500,000 per year to 600,000 per year, meaning that a number of SMEs will no longer be required to pay VAT. Now, we know that the SMEs play an important role in the economy, employing vast numbers of people, including women. And they also help to shape innovation in the country. These incentives will help to keep them in business. And the plans to assume debt, the debt obligation for SMEs, is also a very important one, because in the event that they default on their loan, the government will assume the debt, and this will improve access to loans for those who without adequate collateral, and it will also improve ease of business. The VAT registration threshold increasing from 500,000 to 600,000 will make it easier for SMEs as well as their customers during these harsh economic times. And this will, I now move on to mental health. World Mental Health Day was celebrated on October 10th, and this year's theme was making mental health and well-being for all a global priority. I must admit, it was a bit disappointing to not see any special focus on mental health in the budget, any special mention of mental health in the budget, because we know that the pandemic had an impact, one way or another, on most persons. And now more than ever, we need to see targeted approaches towards mental health. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 4 persons globally will be affected by mental disorder or neurological disorder in their lifetime. 450 million are currently affected by these disorders, such as depression, dementia, and the list goes on. Mental health disorders are a leading cause of disability and a major contributor to the burden of non-communicable diseases in the region. And the World Federation for Mental Health has stated that good mental health is critical to the functioning of society at the best of times. So therefore, it must be front and center of every country's response to and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I must say this too, even as we call on the government to do more this time for mental health, we must not forget that our mental health is ours to protect. We must take responsibility for protecting and nurturing our own health and well-being, and not wait on the government to do so. As I wrap up my presentation, I want to say that my first impression of the budget, based on the highlights alone, was not a very good one. I wasn't able to see the budget or hear the budget when it was read in real time. So I would have seen all the highlights on WhatsApp and Facebook afterward. And I didn't have a very good impression of the budget based on the highlights. But then I went and I read the budget thoroughly, and I was able to formulate my own opinion of it. And my impression has changed. I want to encourage you to do the same. Now, to illustrate what I'm saying, I want to engage in a small exercise with you. So in psychology, perception can be defined as a sensory experience of the world, which includes how an individual recognizes and interprets sensory information. The psychology of perception tells us that we employ two main processes when interpreting something like the budget or budget highlights. There's bottom-up processing, which is based on sensory, which is perception based on sensory inputs alone. We also have top-down processing, which is perception based on the sensory stimulation within a context and based on thought and the environment, etc. So if I were to ask you to look at this image and ask you what it is, you could place in the chat what you think it is. I might look at it and say it is a couch in front of a flat screen TV. Or somebody else might think it's something else. I encourage you to say in the chat what you think it is. Now I move on to the next image. No, but based on this, you would have to use bottom-up processing because all you see is this image. You don't see it in context. If I were to show you this image, you would see between the A and the C, the image now looks like a B because we now interpret it within a specific context. If I were to show you this image, the image now looks like a 13 because between the 12 and the 14, it looks like a 13 because it's in a different context. With top-down processing, we are enabled to streamline the process by relying on context and our pre-existing knowledge to understand what we perceive. And this is why I want to urge you to read the budget. I have asked the host to place links in the chat to the budget, the PDF, and the YouTube version. So if you don't have time to read it, you could watch the video, take a read of the budget, and formulate your own opinion of it. You have to remember that people tend to listen to the budget for specific things. So sometimes looking at the highlights, which cannot give you a full picture of it, or listening to someone else's opinion, that still can't give you a full opinion of it because you have to take it on yourself to read the budget and take what you get out of it, get your own perception of it. So in closing, I hope that you get 3 takeaways from this presentation. The first takeaway is that a budget has a context, and it must be taken in context. The second is that a budget has specific objectives. And the third is that mental health must be given priority. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Stephanie. Your discourse, you would have brought out some really different but pertinent perspectives on today's discussion. You have adequately provided, I would say, a good context within which the fiscal measures were advanced in the budget. I particularly liked your perspectives on linking the fiscal measures to increases in food supply and decreases in food prices. You also mentioned targeting of youths to become more involved in the agricultural sector. And you also hinted towards a plethora of incentives that were introduced to sort of boost economic activity within the agricultural sector. I also acknowledge that you recognize that there was a lack of explicit mention of focus on mental health, but we're yet to see how the policies unfold in terms of at the level of the ministry and so on. What they would have had in store for rolling out in terms of mental health strategies and policies. So I think we have to look at that further. And I particularly saw the audience engaging and responding when you did a little bit of, you introduced the psychological concept. So I think they did appreciate your knowledge of psychology being integrated into the discussion. So thank you, Stephanie, well done. So our second presenter is Mr. Leon Henry. Mr. Henry is an economics teacher at Upper Level Educational Institute. He also lectures economics courses at Roy Tech School of Business and Applied Studies and tutors statistics and economics at Arthur Lovejock Global School of Business at the undergraduate level. Leon has a passion for teaching and is an avid sports fan who enjoys family time and outdoor activities such as hiking and running. Join me in welcoming Mr. Henry to do his presentation today.
All right, so thank you very much, Mrs. Ali. So first to begin with, good evening, everyone. And I want to start off with the definition of what a budget is. It's very important that we understand what our budget is and its purpose before we try to analyze the budget. And it is also important that when we are looking at the budget, we put it in a context in terms of the current economic climate. So my presentation this afternoon will speak about defining the budget in terms of what it is. I will speak about the current economic climate, and then I will discuss my perspective on the budget. Now, so what is our budget? Now, to put it in simple words, a budget is commonly defined as a statement of expenditure and revenues for a defined period of time. Now, basically, the government, who is responsible for fiscal policy, will outline the government's main fiscal measures over the next fiscal year. So the budget gives us or tells us the intentions of the government for the upcoming fiscal year. Now, this year's budget is titled Tenacity and Stability in the Face of Global Challenges. And we have to understand this because the current economic climate is one in which we are now recovering from a global pandemic, which has contributed to a downturn in our economy over the past few years. And in addition to this event, we are also experiencing the effects of the war in Ukraine. And many economists are predicting in the coming months that we are likely to experience another global recession. Now, given these challenges facing our economy, we have to understand that the government, as one of the main agents responsible for macroeconomic policy, will try to attempt to solve these issues by using fiscal policy. It's also important that we understand our economic performance in terms of our current economic climate, and to understand what is taking place in our economy, we can use macroeconomic statistics. So some of the main macroeconomic statistics as identified in the budget quoted by the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago is that we are experiencing an unemployment rate which is around 5.1% as of July 2022, representing an increase of approximately 0.4% from the pre-pandemic levels. It is also stating that this rise in the unemployment rate is not only impacting our economy, but other economies, around the region, in Europe as well, are also experiencing increases in the unemployment rates. Now, another major issue affecting our economy is the rise in the prices of goods and services, which represents our inflation rate. And it has risen from in 2020, we had a very low inflation rate of 0.6%. And, it is evident with the rise in food prices, the rise in fuel prices as well, we are now experiencing an inflation rate of 4.7%. Another indicator outlined in the budget, the minister stated that nominal GDP has increased from 142 billion in 2020 to 190 billion in 2022. Now, using this indicator as a measure of economic growth is not wise, because the main limitation of nominal GDP is that we do not know if the increase in nominal GDP is due to an increase in output or an increase in the price level. But based on our intuition, we can say that because of the increase in prices, we have a rise in the nominal GDP, which does not all goes well for our economy, because a rise in nominal GDP purely attributable to an increase in the prices of goods and services tells us that our economy might actually be contracting rather than expanding. Before I give you guys my take on the budget, I will just want to highlight some of the key statistics coming out of the budget. It was nice that total revenues rose from 43.3 billion in the previous budget to approximately 56.1 billion in this budget. And that represents approximately a 12.8 billion rise in revenues, which is represented by the increase in the oil price, which was based at $66 in the previous budget and now at $90. Now, we know that one of the government's goals is to stimulate our economy, and that comes from government expenditure. So it was nice to see that government expenditure rose from 52.43 billion in 2022 to approximately 57.68 billion in 2023. So there is some stimulus, there is some increase in spending, which all goes well for our economy. Now, overall, we expect a budget deficit of approximately $1.51 billion, which is the lowest since we had a surplus in 2013. Now, it's very important for us to understand that the government is constrained by resources. What do I mean by that? It simply means that the government cannot simply wave a magic wand and satisfy all of our needs and wants. Right? So the government has to make tough choices. Now, when we look at what the government has done as it relates to financing the various sectors in our economy, we have seen once again that education and trading has received the largest slice of the budget of approximately 7.45 billion. And I endorse this, and we all should as well, because we know that one of the greatest resources of an economy is its human resource. And the government has shown that, investing, or putting emphasis on the human resource can lead to intellectual capacity building. It can also lead to the creation of more jobs, as well as ultimately an increase in the level of output. Now, other sectors that has a large portion of the budget is the health sector with 6.89 billion and national security with 5.79 billion. And we will understand that when we look at education, healthcare, and national security, these services tends to be heavily subsidized by the government in the interests of the most vulnerable in society. And of course, national security is there to benefit the entire population. Now, looking at the education sector, I was pleased because one of the issues our economy as well as other countries experienced because of the pandemic was the issue of learning loss. Now, the government implemented a measure called the Structural Remedial Education Program, which is geared towards assisting students who experience learning loss. And this was evident when if we had to take a look at the data, which showed that, for SEA, only about 37% of the students pass, which is the lowest, level of the lowest pass mark that we have experienced. And we also are seeing that, there was a drop as well in the number of students who sat the CXC examinations. We had a number of students who did not take part in those examinations, and the failure rate also increased. So any program, that will help to get students, back on track is very important for developing and enhancing the human capital of any nation. Now, one of the programs that I also support is the amendment of the GATE, which now allows students who are enrolled in the associate degree level are now able to move on to higher degrees such as the bachelor's. Now, another program that also contributes positively to our human capacity is the Youth Apprenticeship Program. And I'm sure that this program, similar to the ongoing on-the-job training program, will provide opportunities for students, to learn on the job and to prepare them, give them jobs, as they contribute positively to our economy. Now, I will now discuss the issue of the fuel subsidy, which has been heavily debated, which is a heavily debated issue. As we have heard many commentators, some people are in favor of the subsidy, some people are against the subsidy. But let us understand the implications of the subsidy. Now, the direct implication of the subsidy in fuel prices is that individuals, we will have to pay more at the pump, for premium, for super gas, as well as for diesel. So that directly affects our purchasing power. So that's a direct, negative result, as we may say, about the subsidy. Now, what the government did say as well, the Minister of Finance, is that by employing this measure, by employing this measure, there's some revenues that can be used and allocated to some of the other sectors, such as, public utilities, as well as the air bridge, notwithstanding that we have to pay an increased fee, but as well as the agricultural sector as well. So there is that trade-off, right? But my opinion here is that I strongly believe that this measure should not have been implemented now, given the inflationary pressures that has been affecting citizens of our country, in particular those who are most vulnerable, such as the fixed income wage earners. Now, it is expected that the rise in the fuel subsidy will reduce the purchasing power of this group of individuals, as well as all groups of individuals who are consumers of goods and services. However, if we are to turn our attention to firms, we know that with the subsidy, it will also lead to an increase in the transportation costs of firms, given that most manufacturing companies they transport goods and services. So we can expect that they will experience an increase in their cost of production. But as it relates to firms, some firms are able to recover some of this cost by simply charging higher prices. Now, as we talk about higher prices, which is perhaps one of our main economic issues, high inflation, I did not really see any measure that the government implemented to try to reduce the inflationary pressures in our economy. And of course, one of the things that we understand as well is that the government is trying to stimulate our economy, and sometimes expansionary fiscal policy may ultimately mean that we are likely to get price increases. But I do feel that the impact of the fuel subsidy, the removal of the prices, is actually going to drive prices even higher. So I strongly believe that this measure, given our current inflationary pressures, which are depressing households, which are restricting our purchasing power, I strongly believe that this policy should not have been implemented now. Now, another major issue that I will briefly like to discuss is the issue of food security. Now, I do understand that the government contribution to the agricultural sector is $1.33 billion, which represents an $18 million increase from last year. But one of the things that we have to understand as well is, unlike the health sector, the education sector, as well as national security, the three sectors with the highest allocation in which we all benefit or have the opportunity to benefit from as the government subsidize these services, the agricultural sector, the government basically facilitates this because the government does not simply produce vegetables and fruit for us to consume directly. The government provides the environment where individuals can access resources and then engage in some private practice to make a revenue or a profit, right? So
Leon?
The allocation to the agricultural sector, we may disagree, but I think...
Leon, are you hearing me?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so you have 1 minute left to wrap up.
Right, so thank you very much. Now, another major issue before I will summarize with this issue. Now, we know that the government is responsible for managing our economy. We also know that when we look at our economy, it consists of consumers, it consists of producers, and we all play a role along with our government in terms of achieving objectives. So my point is this: in order for us to looking at the resources, which is limited, what we have to do is to maximize the resources of our country, and that could come through productivity. All right, we can improve our efficiencies. So thank you very much, Haleema.
Okay, thank you very much, Leon. And we're strapped for time, so otherwise I would have let you continue your very rich discussion. So again, thanks, Leon. You very good and rich presentation. You made a couple of interesting points that I just want to highlight quickly. You mentioned the importance of considering the macroeconomic climate within which the budget or any budget is made, which provides context for the policies that we may have seen, the measures that we've seen emerging. You also mentioned the fact that we are currently, like other economies, facing numerous external shocks, and also reminded us as a good teacher that the government operates within limited resources to meet competing needs. You also mentioned the fact that there were increases in revenue alongside increases in expenditure, which provides good stimulus for the economy. You commended the increase in allocation to the education sector, and I particularly like your highlight of mentioning that some of these funds would go to the issue of remedial learning and meeting those needs. I heard you in your latter discussion about the increases in gas prices, and I know that has been dealt with largely in different audiences, and the likely impact on low and middle income households, as well as the increases in transport prices and food prices in the near future. So thank you, Leon, very good presentation. Our next speaker is Mr. Ruqayyah Scott. So Ruqayyah holds a BSc in economics with a minor in environmental economics. She's currently pursuing a Master's of Science in Development Statistics at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Passionate about leadership, economics, politics, and diplomacy, Ruqayyah has been working with many civil society groups, government agencies, and youth-led entities to fulfill her passion. Join me as I welcome Ruqayyah.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. And, a very warm hello to my fellow panelists. And I'm really happy to be here because some of these panelists have taught me in my undergrad. So it's a very pinch me moment for me to be here today. So coming out of the finance minister's budget presentation, there were countless thoughts that came to my mind on the various policies that were introduced. And there have been so many discussions amongst the entire population on how this budget is going to impact lives and what does this mean for our future. And the panelists that went before did an excellent job of setting the scene. So I'm not going to go into any of explaining what the budget is really targeted towards. I'm going to focus my discussion on the impact and my thoughts and opinions on the budget presentation. So I would first like to start by highlighting at what seems to appear to be as positives, right? There is a national service program of Trinidad and Tobago that will seek to provide a certificate upon completion by participants that will be recognized by employers and training providers. And I think this can be a fantastic opportunity. There is a school to work apprenticeship allowance, which is aimed at assisting young people with gaining the relevant work experience to penetrate the job market. And I think this is also something that we really need, especially as we deal with the challenges in the labor market locally. There was the long-term loan guarantee scheme for SMEs in the non-energy sector, which is a huge opportunity for the agricultural industry and the manufacturing industry as well. The personal income tax allowance, by increasing the limit, now someone who earns $7,500 and less will be exempt from paying the income tax. And in a way, it sort of increases the disposable income of people. There were measures taken to strengthen penalties for illegal state timbering, illegal quarrying, scrap iron theft, and oil pollution, which I think are all great things to implement so that we can prevent these illegal activities from happening. And lastly, something that I would like to applaud is the provisions to encourage renewable energy use by the agricultural and manufacturing companies, though I would have preferred to hear a lot more on the renewable energy sector, especially since, I proudly did my minor in environmental economics. That was something that I wish to see that was expanded on a little bit more. However, we await to see what this policy will introduce. So while these initiatives sound very promising, we are left to see how they are going to be implemented, if implemented at all, which seems to be a lingering problem in Trinidad and Tobago for decades before I was even born. Many persons amongst our population, they say government come, government go, nothing really changes because of the system of governance that we have implemented, right? So therefore, there are always going to be issues no matter what minister or prime minister that you have, because the framework has not really changed. But as a result, that change can happen, and it can happen once we have the political will and tenacity in order to change those governance structures. But I want to focus my discussion today on the impact on people. For me, I think economics is centered around people and livelihoods and the experiences that we have and how we can all collectively contribute to the success of our nations. And therefore, the policies introduced in the budget is going to impact us in negative and positive ways. So my first question is, what is the government's goal and vision for Trinidad and Tobago? What is our future plan? And subsequently, how do the policies implemented help us reach that goal? Generally, I feel that there is a disconnect where this is concerned, especially as it pertains to communicating to the public. How do these policies help us reach where we want to go? Because where do we want to go? Where do we need to be in 5 years? And I feel as though this is not necessarily widely discussed. And even if there is a plan, we see that plan is not very well met as administrations change. And it gives us the impression that we exist within a governance structure that implements policies that are just vague or are not connected to the needs of people. So glaring at specific elements of the budget, the first issue that I would like to raise is that of the removal of the fuel subsidy and the associated increase in gas prices. Now, as Mr. Leon Henry correctly said, this has been debated by everybody. We all know some people are for it, some people are against it, right? However, we asked the question, what is the reason for removing the subsidy? And the finance minister said, well, by removing the subsidy, we can save the state a lot of money, and that money can be used in other programs that can help develop our country. I believe it would be in the interest of the government for us to have a clear and concise plan as to what those developmental projects are going to look like. Should we have all the savings? What are we going to do with the money that we are going to save? And I feel this will help us as citizens understand, okay, if they're removing a subsidy, this is why. And once we're able to understand that, maybe we can, we can respond to it a bit better. However, the reality is we're not sure what those development policies are going to look like, but what we do know is that gas prices have gone up, and that is now going to affect us. So in light of this, when gas prices go up, our traveling costs get higher, especially given that we have such a massive traffic problem. So how does this relate to gas prices? Well, longer commute times due to traffic burns more fuel, which means people pay higher prices at the pump. Now, what are some possible solutions for this? As a young person, I am a huge advocate for work from home policy. Now, work from home is something that we have practiced in the private and public sector during the 2-year lockdown period in COVID-19 in Trinidad and Tobago, and we have had various experiences with it. There have been some success stories and there have been some failure stories as well. And what we also have is people who prefer to go to work and people who prefer to stay at home. But we also have to remember that yes, we may have some technical difficulties as we go to certain communities where people just cannot, they don't have the ability to work from home because they don't have the technology. So with all this, taken into consideration, I really think if we are to adopt a work from home policy, we need to take a multifaceted approach to be able to develop a framework where it fits for everyone. In that way, jobs that cannot necessarily fit into a work from home model, those persons go to work physically. But for those where you can have a work from home model, we implement that. And nobody is saying you send home the entire public sector. That is not what I am here advocating. But what I am saying is that we can have a rotation system, a hybridized system. That way, if it's 2 days at home, 3 days at work, or even 1 day for the week, I think this will significantly help us with less cars on the road. It will help us with our traffic problem. It will help us with our gas problem. Now, if someone decides to take their car and go, to the beach, which is also far, Yes, that is also going to, add to their gas prices, but at least that is something within their control, but not giving us an option for us to be able to determine how we work is a bit constricting. And I think as a country that is looking to the future, to be more developed, to be more modern, I think this is something that we can implement. And studies have shown that, working from home increases the productivity of employees, reduces stress and frustration, and allows them to have a better work-life balance and overall reduces mental stress. Now, of course, this may not be for everyone, but if it can help someone, I truly believe that we can find some way to accommodate that. Another way in which this impacts our population is the business community. Now, the government claimed that they did not increase diesel, and this will assist the business community. However, not every business has vehicles that use diesel. What about our micro and small enterprises? For example, the online clothing store who uses his or her vehicle to make deliveries that uses super or premium. So when statements are made that claim this certain policy is not going to affect the entire community, we really need to examine, is it that it's not going to affect the entire community, or is it's just not going to affect a certain aspect of that community? And I think we need to be very careful in the language that we use. Another point I would like to make is on education. As a student, I value tertiary education a lot. I think it is very important in our economy, no matter how much like we tell ourselves that, a degree is not required for today's working world. However, while that may be true in many countries around the world, I look daily at different vacancies, and most of them, if not all, ask for a first degree. So I'm really, really happy to see that we've made this adjustment to GATE to allow those persons to at least have a first degree or to pursue higher technical studies, because I do believe this will alleviate the stress and allow people to gain that education. However, what I would like to see in the future is some consideration given to postgraduate studies, which was something that was implemented prior, but it was removed. But the reason for this is I believe that postgraduate studies is where you get to delve deeper to enhance your skills that are needed for our development. So perhaps we could have had something like a minimum of 25% available for postgraduate studies, because 25% is still means that you're going to save 25%, and that 25% can be used for something else. So the same way the finance minister said the money that we're going to save from not having the fuel subsidy, we can use that for something else. It's the same concept here. And I really think this is something that we can look towards in the future, and I would love to see that implemented. So this year's theme was tenacity and stability in the face of global challenges. And I understand that the government tried to stabilize the economy and to implement policies that will help steer us in the right direction. However, the implementation of that needs to be considered. However, there are still some aspects of this budget that I feel is disconnected from the needs of our population. And I think what we need to take into consideration is that not all of us are in the same boat. Some of us have different circumstances, and therefore when we're implementing policies, we need to make sure that they are as intersectional as possible. So the theme was tenacity and stability. When I look up the term tenacity, words such as determination, courage, spirit, and resolution appear. And if I be honest, those are exactly what I think this budget has been lacking in. Thank you so much, and I look forward to any questions at the end.
Okay, so thank you so much, Ruqayyah. I must commend you for a very focused presentation. You also commended in your discourse quite a few of the fiscal measures introduced, and you immediately went on to recognize the issue of implementation or lack thereof with respect to fiscal measures, and us having a history of that. You also hinted towards better sensitization, and perhaps I want to add accountability of the population in terms of how the fiscal measures would actually improve lives and so on. And you use the example of the savings from the subsidy and how it would be spent to improve lives. I take moderator liberty here to add a point. And sometimes it's not what you introduce, but how you introduce it. And perhaps there may have been merit in using a period of moral suasion to sort of sensitize the population to the removal of the subsidy, even during a period of external shocks that we've been experiencing. You also call for the reconsideration of postgraduate programs that can be accessed through date, and I totally endorsed that comment. You emphasize the need for alignment of measures with the needs of the population, and again, fantastic comment. And so, Ruqayyah, well done, excellent presentation. I want to take this opportunity to remind members of the audience that you are encouraged to send your questions in the chat, and so they will be directed to the presenters as we proceed. Our final presenter is Ms. Malini Maharaj. Ms. Maharaj is currently an assistant lecturer with the Department of Economics. Her areas of expertise are sustainable development, environmental economics, and the Caribbean economy. Her research also includes open budgets, which she has completed for Trinidad and Tobago for the past 10 years. The focus of her presentation today is on governance, open budgets, and sustainable development. Welcome, Ms. Maharaj.
Thank you, Haleema, and thank you for those very encouraging presentations from the youth. I must admit, I don't see myself as a youth per se, but as part of the panel, I feel encouraged by the contributions that have been made so far. And they actually demonstrate the potential that our youth offer to our society, and the opportunities that we have to look forward to as they are making these observations, as they are making these contributions. We see that they are indeed well prepared to take on that helm of decision making and to lead, hopefully, in the near future. Now, all of the presenters spoke to the content of the budget, and I would like to commend them for highlighting that content aspect, but they also highlighted the role of a budget and what a budget is defined as. And I want to build on that, because one of the things I am particularly opinionated about is the fact that a budget is not just a document. Part of the budget is a document, and yes, it is perhaps the most important document that a government would produce. But more important than that is the budget process. The budget process itself speaks to some of the issues that Ruqayyah, that Leon, that even Stephanie highlighted in terms of decision making. What have we done in terms of monitoring the budget process and identifying the needs of the population within these decisions that are made? So while the budget tends to preoccupy most of the period of October, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, what happens after October? You know, I think that's equally important. What happens after the budget is enacted, and what goes through the informing process of the decisions that are made and the outcomes that are associated with these decisions. And I think that sort of speaks to the point that Ruqayyah made, and that I saw Andre post to the chat in terms of bridging that gap between policy and practice. How do we get greater buy-in to the budget process? How does governance lead to development, as it involves not just the government making decisions, but the decisions of the population, particularly our youth, because that is the intention of today's presentation, to discuss the youth priorities and to see how these priorities are met by the budget, but also how they should have been treated as part of public participation in forming budget priorities even before the budget is presented. So why I want to speak to this process is because it has been found that the budget and the role of the budget as an element of good governance has a direct link to development. Because what happens is that through the budget process, we are able to determine the priorities of the population. And Ruqayyah mentioned as well, you know, the need for us to make this connection between policies and economics and true human development, so that when we look at the resource allocation issues and the constraints associated with resource allocation, we ensure that the decisions lead to sustainable development. So yes, economic objectives are important, and the budget is an economic tool, but more so, the budget should be connected to the other objectives of sustainable development, ensuring that there is that connection between the social objectives as well as environmental objectives. And our panelists spoke to that. So Stephanie spoke about agriculture. Leon highlighted quite a lot of the macroeconomic prerogatives that are required from the budget. And Ruqayyah, in addition to that, also spoke of that environmental dimension where she mentioned the renewable energy issues and the associated sort of challenges involved when we look at these issues. So I think, you know, it contextualizes the fact that when we have to evaluate a budget needs to be more than just the content, but also the process through which outcomes are met. So a budget itself is more than just a year planning. And I saw Professor Theodore indicate that in Trinidad, we do have a Vision 2030, which speaks to that sort of medium to long-term perspective, and that guides the priority areas of our budgets, and that has been used following the Vision 2020 document. So we want to ensure that in evaluating our budget, that we also evaluate how the budget itself addresses the needs of our stakeholders and the issues and concerns of our stakeholders as well. And here, the stakeholders that we are highlighting on this forum are our youth. So I think apart from evaluating and discussing the content of the budget that was presented, we want this discussion to be a long-term discussion, a process that does not die off at the end of October, but one that has continuity insofar that the youth, the stakeholders that are speaking today, are able to contribute to the budget process throughout the fiscal year, including and in particular the budget formulation process. So this is where I think the forum and those who are presenting here today and those who are present in the participants can identify, can raise their voice, can voice their concerns to become more integrated in the budget process. And at the beginning, for example, Haleema pointed out that, you know, it's this sort of forum that you, the youth, are able to voice your opinions, and that she said youth voices matters. And this is again why I'm saying it is important to ensure that you become part of the budget process and become that part of the budget planning process as well, not just the evaluators of its content. So that way we ensure that you are also part of the governance structure. You're also part of the decision makers that decide on what our priorities are. So the content was very richly covered by our panelists. And to that, I would just like to move on to show again how this content and process is linked to development. And when we look at the processes involved in good governance, Ruqayyah, Haleema, and even Stephanie and Leon, you know, started talking about accountability, holding the population, holding the decision makers accountable. But it also involves transparency, participation, and of course, rule of law, equity. You know, we had we have been having so much discussion about the implications of the removal of the fuel subsidy. And this speaks a lot to equity concerns, you know, with the recognition that it may have different impacts on different groups of our population. So, you know, we want to consider equity, responsiveness, and consensus orientation. And why are all of these important? Because it enables our citizens, it enables you, the youth, to become part of the developmental process by voicing your concerns, by being heard and identifying what your priorities are. You are not only the objects, you know, you're not treated as a target group, but you are part of the process. You become involved in determining the outcomes rather than being the outcome itself. And that is what we want for you. We want these voices, these concerns to be part of the process of development so that the decisions made via the budget are not just a reflection of those that hold particular seats, but those that are willing to communicate with the stakeholders and voice your concerns and take into consideration your concerns as the future leaders. So if I were to ask those of you present here today, you know, in terms of your understanding, your exposure, because people would have different experiences, to what extent do you think there would have been public consultation, particularly with vulnerable groups, particularly with groups such as yourselves, that were informed or that informed the budget process itself, that were taken into consideration prior to the presentation of the budget statement in Parliament? Is there evidence of contributions from stakeholders? Now, we do know that part of our budget process does indeed involve stakeholder consultations, some degree of public consultations. But what I think is important is for us to see the output coming from these consultations. What were some of the suggestions made, and what were the priorities identified by the stakeholders, such as the youth? Another question that challenges the accountability, transparency, and public participation role of the budget is the timing for us to actually give feedback following the presentation of the budget. We have had several discussions from the day of the budget statement, the date the budget statement was presented, and there are ongoing contributions at Parliament, within the Senate, within the House of Representatives. But then with regard to public feedback, how much of the public feedback actually goes into, you know, responding and having sufficient time to respond to the budget, but also impacting on whether the budget itself is varied. The budget as it is presented is a proposal, and the idea is that when it is proposed, that debates and discussions can also influence it. So is there really any value to debates, discussions, particularly from the public, that really causes any variance, that contributes to any variance from the budget proposal to the enacted budget? And then we ask if, I'm asking you whether you see your priorities highlighted. And again, I cannot speak to your priorities. Again, I'm not necessarily a youth according to the definition of what a youth includes, but I can certainly say that I would, through my interactions with many of you, say that at least unemployment and underemployment seem to be a major concern. And again, our panelists spoke to this: education and training, crime and security, climate resiliency, etc. So they spoke extensively to the various policies presented in the budget statement, and they highlighted, you know, their opinions in terms of the value of these policies. But in this context, and going along with the topic that I am presenting on, I would like to read what was identified by a Caribbean Regional Youth Council that was held in 2019. And they said that it was important for discussions to address issues such as how can education and decent work serve to promote the empowerment, and I want to again highlight that, the empowerment, inclusion, and equality among youth in the Caribbean. How inequality affects youth empowerment and inclusion in the Caribbean. And again, when we talk about empowerment and we talk about inclusion, we're also talking about hearing your voices, having you become part of your own development as much as we would have you represent some outcomes of development as well. And with this, I just want to quickly highlight some issues related to Trinidad and Tobago's budget process. A recent study that I was able to complete in putting together what is called an open budget index for Trinidad and Tobago suggested that with regard to transparency, public participation, and budget oversight, Trinidad and Tobago's budget process seems to be lacking. And I think, again, this is perhaps one of the major challenges we have had with converting our policies into practice, and with seeing how the policies that are presented in our budget documents translate to meaningful outcomes. And it's perhaps because the public does not have as much buy-in. It is perhaps because a lot of what happens in terms of transparency requires more information being prepared and presented to the public so that they understand the decisions that are made. And it also involves greater budget oversight to ensure that when our scarce resources are allocated, that they are used efficiently and that they also match the outcomes for which they are used. So another example of what the budget process requires, particularly for Trinidad and Tobago from a comparative point of view, is greater transparency. Again, it speaks to the challenge of not just how we allocate our resources, but what is done and what the outcomes are when we allocate our limited resources. So in the interest of time, I just want to summarize and suggest that while the panelists before would have highlighted quite a lot regarding the content, I, from my perspective, would like to highlight the process involved in the budget and reinforce again that the youth has a key role to play in ensuring that our national budget enhances good governance and leads to the type of outcomes that we want to see. All right, so just some closing recommendations based on the output of the Open Budget Index that I would leave up for your comment, but I'm welcome to share more results and entertain more questions. So back to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Maharaj, for that very, very detailed presentation. And I thought it brought together nicely the issues relating to looking further and deeper into what the budget involves in terms of the process, and not just what the output is in terms of the budget statement, but understanding that there are guiding principles and overarching goals and so on of the government that would guide the process of what happens. And I hear you called for increased transparency and increasing youth participation and so on. I particularly like your mention of the focus on sustainable development. And I want to, again, take some liberty here to say that we are often called upon to sort of assess how we perform as small islands with respect to the sustainable development goals. But do we really understand what it takes to get there? And we are looking at the higher end than where we should be. But the process, and it brings me back to that, the process lends itself to that implementation, perhaps that implementation gap in terms of policy leading to the achievement of goals and so on. So excellent presentation, Malini, and I really like the fact that you brought together nicely the issues that emerged during the presentation. So thank you. We are running a bit behind time, so what I'll do for the Q&A session, I will advance 3 questions to one for each of the presenters, and I'll perhaps put 2 general questions which the presenters can comment on if the time permits. And if we do have time, I'll do another round of questions. I ask the presenters, please be brief in your responses because we do want to address as many questions as we can. So I have the first question for Ms. Theodore. It says the Minister of Health outlined the policy framework of mental health in his budget speech. While it was not on the actual budget speech by the Minister of Finance, it was developed as a key milestone on the decentralization of mental health and the mental health activities and programs for COVID-19. I think it's a comment. So you may want to address that briefly. And I think so that you would address that one. Leon, a member of the audience is asking for clarity with respect to your productivity point that you raised in your presentation. Ruqayyah, someone is asking about what are cost-effective and safe ways to travel versus using your own vehicle. And I think that's a really practical question. There's another question for Ruqayyah. Okay, so I'll put forward one question for Ruqayyah, and if we have time, we'll advance more. And for all did I miss anybody? Oh, and Malini, can you identify ways that youths can be involved in the budget process and be how can we get their views? And so is it that we need to have a stakeholder session, or what are your recommendations there? For all the presenters now, if you were in the Minister of Finance position, what would you have done differently? And I hope I'm asking the question correctly. What would you have done differently in terms of the measures adopted and the fiscal measures that you would advance? So I think we could start with Stephanie.
Okay, thank you, Haleema. I want to thank Mr. Jason for his comment. And I want to say that I'm very happy to hear that the Minister of Health outlined it in the policy framework, in a framework in his budget speech. However, I think that given the situation that we're facing from the fallout from the pandemic, and then now with the upsurge in violence and crime in our country, I think that a special mention in the budget would have sent a message to the nation that we have mental health on the agenda, and that they too should have it on the agenda. So I'm really happy to hear that they have plans, but I just think that it would have been good to mention it in the budget as well.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think we can have perhaps Leon or Ruqayyah with whoever is ready. Leon, I see Leon. Or Ruqayyah is ready. Okay, Ruqayyah.
Yeah, I'm ready. So the question was about what are some cost-effective ways for us to engage, to try and save instead of using our own vehicle. To be very honest, I would love if I'm able to provide a clear-cut answer on what it is you should do, because the reality of it is traveling may not be one, the preference of everybody, but two, traveling could be unsafe as well, and traveling could be expensive depending on where you are coming from, especially since you stated that taking a TT ride share costs you like $200 one way from where you live to your workplace. So the issue is not necessarily whether it's using your private vehicle versus traveling, because both are going to add up in cost. What I think is, how do we allow people to save by them not having to utilize the traveling method or their own vehicles to go to work if they do not absolutely positively need to be physically there in order to get the job done. I feel very passionately about work from home, but as I said in my presentation, prior, it is a very, it has multiple aspects that we need to take into consideration. So I'm not saying that the entire country, the 1.4 million of us, but of course the working population, I'm not saying the entire working population needs to stay home for the rest of their lives. But what I'm trying to advocate for is some sort of method for us to at least allow that option to be a viable option for those who wish to utilize that option if they live very far from their workplace, or if they would prefer to work from home on X particular amount of days. So I feel as though that is one of the ways that we can definitely save. But in terms of whether traveling versus, using your own vehicle, I don't necessarily have a particular opinion on either or of those, because I think whether you choose to travel or use your own particular vehicle, I think the circumstances for everyone is much different.
Okay, thank you, Ruqayyah. Leon?
Leon is muted.
Right, sorry. Thank you very much, Mrs. Ali. And the point on productivity is related to maximizing our resources. We know that the government in any given year cannot accomplish all of its goals in terms of allocating resources to the various sectors. But what is important is that there is spending by the government, and at the same point in time, in order to get the best possible outcome, we need individuals to be productive in the workplace. So it's about improving efficiency. It's about becoming productive in order to get the best use of our resources to get the best possible outcome. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Leon. Malini?
Yes, hi. So thank you for the question. Some of the recommendations coming out of the Open Budget Survey involved developing pilot mechanisms to monitor budget implementation, to expand mechanisms during budget formulation and engage civil society organizations. And I saw in the chat, and I'm seeing some questions coming across with suggestions such as involving the University of the West Indies, as Professor Theodore pointed out. And I think that is exactly what we need to do, because we need to take responsibility as a public to ensure that we hold the government accountable. So we cannot expect that we want accountability if we are not being responsible for it ourselves and taking that as part of our expectations of the persons that we put into the seat to make these types of decisions. Other recommendations include actively engaging with vulnerable and underrepresented communities, and again, ensuring that civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations fulfill that and facilitate that role in doing so. And finally, I also would like to recommend that we provide feedback, or that at least the government provides feedback on budget proposals that are informed through public consultation. So we're able to see where consultations do take place, how they are incorporated into the budget itself. Thank you, Haleema.
Okay, great. Thank you, presenters. I have one question for Leon. Leon, how effective would restricting imports on certain foreign goods, example, cereal, alcohol, and so on, and boosting the manufacturing and agricultural sector be on reducing the price of these goods? Just a brief comment, Leon.
Now, it will be effective if we are able to implement the policy. For the mere fact that we know that our food import bill has been averaging around $5 billion per year, and the government, if it is effective in using a strategy of expenditure switching, where we put restrictions and tariffs on the importation of these goods, and maybe we can provide at the same point in time an incentive for individuals, because we have intelligent people, the agricultural sector, the manufacturing sector can work hand in hand in producing these similar type of goods. So it's about switching expenditure by implementing tariffs, you know, and import controls, and we producing the goods that we like. So thank you very much, Ms. Haleema.
Okay, great. Good response, Leon. So we are basically running out, we're out of time for the Q&A, but I want to thank everyone who would have put their comments in the chat. We appreciate your feedback, and our presenters will be considering them for taking them on board. So I would like to now invite Mr. Joel Jordan from the Department of Economics to bring closing remarks. And then I would return to say one line to close it. Joel?
Hi, good day, everyone. I'm Joel Jordan from the Department of Economics, and I've been given the opportunity to give the vote of thanks. And I would really like to extend a very hearty vote of thanks to all who have attended our virtual Youth Budget Forum, Perspectives on the Trinidad and Tobago Budget 2023, and all of those who contributed to this afternoon's proceedings on Zoom. We would also like to thank the head of department, Dr. Anwar Mohammed, and the director of the HEU Center for Health Economics, Dr. Altia Lafoucade, for believing and supporting this particular initiative. I would like to thank those who brought greetings. That will be Mr. Trey Richards, the president of the Economics Students Society of the University of the West Indies, and Ms. Haleema Ali Sisbane, who basically did double duty in terms of she brought greetings on behalf of the director of the HEU, and she also moderated the forum this afternoon. We'd like to thank our panelists, Ms. Stephanie Theodore, Mr. Leon Henry, Ms. Ruqayyah Scott, Ms. Malini Maharaj, and it is with a sense of gratitude that I also like to thank Ms. Patricia Edwards-Westcott, who would have, without her logistical support, this event would not really have been possible. Thank you very much for staying on, for contributing towards this particular webinar, and have a good afternoon, everyone, and stay safe.
Okay, so thank you, Joel, and to everyone, thanks. Big thank you. It has been a great session, and you'll hear from us with other events. Thanks.